Hi, folks. Adam Taggart here, co-founder of peakprosperity.com. I'm back this week with John Rubino, Charles Hughes Smith, and we're also joined by my co-founder, Chris Martenson, today. We're picking up where we left off last week with the discussion that we filmed titled Economic Shockwaves, where we talked about the economic disruption that's rippling across the planet right now, triggered by the coronavirus, and that's also triggering a concomitant market correction. As of today, I believe the S&P is still down about 25% from the February highs. So in last week's discussion, we talked about sort of what was happening in real time and what were the causes that led up to the instability that is now correcting in real time. We ended last week's conversation with a question on what comes next. And we didn't have a lot of time to delve into that because it was the end of the discussion, but we received an awful lot of feedback from viewers that they would love to see another discussion focused around that question, meaning when the dust settles from the current disruption that's going on globally, from the coronavirus, the market meltdown, and we know the full extent of the economic damage that's happened. What is that world going to look like? Joined again by John Rubino, proprietor of dollarcollapse.com and author of The Money Bubble. John, thanks again for joining.
Thanks, Adam.
All right, and Charles Hughes Smith, connecting with us again from the big island of Hawaii. Charles writes analysis at his blog of2minds.com and has written really more books than I have opportunity to list here. But his most recent work, or most recent book titled Money and Work Unchained, predicted a lot of what's actually happening right now. And a great book to go read to understand what's happening if you haven't read it yet already. Charles, thanks again for joining us.
Aloha.
All right. Well, aloha. Thanks. And Chris joining us from his new home property in Massachusetts. Great to see you again, Chris.
Hey, Adam. It's good to be here with everybody. And John and Charles, thanks so much for joining us all. It's going to be really looking forward to this.
Thanks, Chris.
Well, gents, I'm sure it feels to all of us like we've been living on Zoom, recording videos over the past 4 or 5 weeks here as all this has been going down. But if you don't mind joining me for the next 45 minutes, let's get into this discussion because there's a huge amount of interest from our audience in not just surfing in real time what's going on, but really beginning to think about what is going to happen once the correction is all over and we're starting from some sort of new baseline. It's becoming increasingly clear that a number of parts of the old normal may not be part of the new normal. And so people are really trying to understand what is this new era that we may be entering into going to look like, feel like, what are preparations we could take today to better prepare ourselves for what's coming, and what are going to be the new models that may emerge, coming out of the rubble and detritus of the existing system as it's correcting/collapsing here. So I've got a couple of different themes I'd like to talk about with you guys. The first is the economy. So until the late 20th century, world economic growth was pretty much fueled by the next trade route or finding the next undiscovered territory, right? We were consuming a pie that had not yet been fully scoped. That ended in the middle of the 20th century, and economic growth then really began to get fueled by financialization, which really is a mechanism for pulling tomorrow's growth into today. So we were able to keep growth rates going, but it really was at the expense of the future, right? And what it appears now is that, that obviously has some sort of mathematical terminus, and we might be arriving at that now. So my big question for you all around the economy is the era of growth over? Will we ever be able to get back to the economic growth that our economy likes to function well at, 3, 4, 5%? Or are we really entering a new era where growth is going to become much harder to come by? And if the answer is yes to that, what does that world look like? And what sort of new economic models should we be exploring to replace it? John, let's start with you.
Okay, well, the kind of growth that we've pursued in the past, as you said, it has a mathematical limit to it. So we're not going to go forward knocking down forests and putting office buildings and strip malls and things where the forest used to be anymore, because that requires resources that increasingly don't exist. But there can still be wealth creation, and there can still be growth of a kind, but it'll be online in a lot of cases, and it'll be via biotechnology and new kinds of technology otherwise that don't require huge amounts of natural resources and human resources in order to achieve. That's going to be a big change, because so much of what we've done in the past was the easy part. It was the low-hanging fruit. You poke a hole in the Saudi Arabian desert and oil spouts up. And so we have a petroleum-based economy. And the same kind of calculus was true in a lot of different aspects of life where, you can't do that anymore. So what we're going to have to do is, one, live smaller in a lot of physical ways, and two, pursue wealth creation in virtual ways and in scientific ways. So we can still do it. The transition will be incredibly messy. And that's what I think a lot of people are interested in. How do we get from here to there? There's going to be a world in the future that works. But the process of getting from here to there is going to be incredibly painful. And I'll keep the rest of this answer very short because everybody else has a lot to say about this. But that process, I think, is fascinating. What we have to go through and how we survive that process is something that's on a lot of people's minds. And I think it's something we should all be looking at and trying to, it's a course that we should be trying to chart for ourselves.
All right, and just sort of gut feel, gut prediction, in terms of the time of that process. You say it's going to be a painful transition. Just guesstimate, what do you think that transition is going to be measured in? A couple of years, decades? What are you thinking of?
Well, we're on internet time, so things happen faster. As we found out with the coronavirus,
Right.
We went from normal to global depression in 2 months. So it could be that the transition to whatever comes next happens more quickly than seems likely. But, I would guess a decade or more that we have to go through, because, there are all kinds of unexpected things that happen along the way. When you have a gigantic financial crisis and or a big natural disaster, and we're going through both of those right now, you tend to get geopolitical chaos, which means maybe a big war, something like that, or just plain political chaos, which means countries go through cycles that takes each of them a long time to recover from. So, it could be a long transition, but there could be pockets where it happens more quickly. As the saying goes, the future is actually here. It's just unevenly distributed.
Right.
And
Chris likes to say a lot, local mileage will vary.
Yeah. And see, that's going to be the case. For some people, this future that we're talking about is already here. For some others, it'll be here very quickly. And for others, it's going to take 20 or 30 years before they get back to something that they consider normal and natural and right. So there isn't one number, but there is a process that's going to include all of this stuff. And, from a finance and political and economics geek standpoint, which is my standpoint, it's going to be fascinating. It's going to be a lot of fun to watch from a safe distance, but very dangerous if you're in the middle of it.
Right. All right. Well, Charles, at the end of our conversation last week on beginning to address this topic, you really put your finger on sustainability as a key requirement for the economic models that are going to need to replace what's in place right now. Feel free to build on anything that John just mentioned, but I'd love to dig into your thoughts about, what are components of a sustainable economy relative to the current economic structure we have in place?
Okay, great. Well, I'll start with what John said last session. He hit on, to me, a key point, which is if you do not have a stable financial system, you're not going to be able to have a stable social or political system. And if we look back at history, we see that we see this as true. In other words, when the financial sector of an empire starts corroding, like the currencies debased, then all the attempts to keep the thing afloat end up floundering, right? And so that's something that when we talk about the economy, it's really the foundation for what we hope to have socially and politically. But just to kind of touch on another topic that John mentioned was cycles. And of course, Joseph Tainter and other authors have dug into why did empires erode and then collapse. And Tainter's answer was they achieved a level of complexity that the cost of maintaining that complexity exceeded, the earnings, if you will, of the entire empire. And so what happens is you get a Western Roman Empire situation where there's still an infrastructure, but there's no longer enough earnings or surplus capital to support it. And so I think we're at that point in a lot of ways globally. So there's that. And then I just want to touch real quickly on the value system that we have now. And that when empires start collapsing, you'll see like a shift in values from some focus on the common good to total personal greed. And the idea that we have in the West, and I think it's basically a global value system, is if everybody tries to maximize their profit, some sort of magic is going to make it going to serve the common good. And I think we're at a point where that is proven to be untrue. And so we're going to have to develop some values other than just maximizing profit. And so I think I look to the community for that. In other words, the community can generate currency. It can generate gainful employment. And if you're going to look for the for-profit only sector to do those things, that's where the failure is going to occur. Those for-profit only sectors are not going to be able to create gainful employment or a stable economy.
Great point. Is another way to say what you've just said there, that as the pie stops growing, there becomes increased competition for the slices that are left. And what tends to happen is those that have the greatest advantage, the greatest market power, whatever, are able to grab an unfair share, maybe an increasingly unfair share as time goes on of what's left until it doesn't work anymore. And so therefore, we need to basically have a different way in which that pie is redistributed going forward.
Yeah, that's right. And if you go back to the Western Roman Empire, you can look at the patrician class used to have something on the order of 16 times the wealth of a farmer or a craftsperson. And then by the end of the empire, they had 10,000 or 100,000 times the wealth. And so you go, well, that sounds extremely familiar, doesn't it?
I was just about to say that, yeah.
Yeah.
See the charts of the 0.1% versus everybody else. It sounds very, very similar. So you mentioned a couple things about, about new types of currencies to support the economic system. I want to come back to that in just a moment. Before I do, though, I want to round out here with Chris. Chris, you and I have been talking for, over a decade about the 3 E's, about the long-term unsustainable structure of the system that's currently been in place, and warning folks that at some point, as Charles was saying, that you grow your debts faster than your income for too long, and you're simply not going to be able to support that system at some point in time. You've also talked about net energy as a requirement to support that economic system as well. I'd love to get your thoughts on, given what you're seeing right now, are you seeing sort of the tipping point that you've been predicting for so long? Is what's happening right now the transition from old system working to old system breakdown, or is this just one of many speed bumps along the way?
All right, I will try and get this in. Hopefully my internet connection can persist through the whole answer. If it doesn't, just let me know. So there was always going to be something like this. It was going to come along and make the credit bubble end. This was a really dumb experiment we started running in the 70s and 80s, and then it became enshrined as dogma. This crazy idea that you could grow your debts at twice the rate of your income forever. And it was patently, mathematically, sophomorically stupid idea, but it kind of became the whole way of everything operating. So I truly believe, Adam, that this coronavirus, only 38 kilobytes of information has come along and has wrecked the entire operating system that we used to have, what we called how things work, that what was enshrined as sophisticated, seemingly sophisticated financial algorithms and arbitrage strategies and political dynasties, all of that were really hinged on what John and Charles have talked about so far.
Looks like we just lost Chris there. He's been having some connectivity problems. He's going to try to get those fixed. In the interim, John, I believe that you had something to build on to what Chris just said there.
Yeah, because Chris made a good point about the unsustainability of the system that we'd created. And we really did create a system that required perfection to operate. We went off the gold standard in 1971, and everybody, basically had an unlimited credit card from that point forward. And we became dependent on being able to borrow new money in order to finance the old debt we've taken on. At the same time, we created a globalized financial and manufacturing system that required the whole supply chain, multi-country supply chains, to work perfectly. In other words, no natural disasters anywhere along the line, no big wars, no debilitating civil unrest. And look through history and try to find a time when it was like that for a long period of time. And they're very rare in history, but we became dependent on the system that had to operate that way. In other words, had to be perfect. And so the coronavirus came along and broke the global supply chain, among other things, and showed us how fragile this system is. We're wildly, deeply indebted right now because we got used to just borrowing new money to finance the old debt that we took on, and we've got bits and pieces of the supply chain for pretty much every product that are down now. So nothing can be built anywhere in the world right now. And this is all, it's like a person having a heart attack. It shows you the unsustainability of your lifestyle. And now our challenge is to kind of pick up the pieces and learn how to live in a sustainable way. And that means kind of jettisoning an awful lot of what we've depended on, what we just thought of as reality. Central banks with unlimited printing presses, fractional reserve banking, governments with unlimited deficit budgets, just-in-time inventory systems, all of that stuff is unsustainable and has to be replaced. So now our challenge is, how do we replace them in a way that doesn't put us through another Great Depression? And it's not clear that we can do that, but that's the challenge going forward. So I think it's a really interesting challenge, but it's also a very scary one.
Boy, there's so much I want to unpack in there, John. So I totally agree with you. On the globalization side, globalization's been a big driving force of the past several decades, right? And you can make pros and cons for it, right? Pros, it helped build this unbelievably efficient, just-in-time supply chain network that you talked about, right? Where we can get our cheap stuff from Walmart, delivered by the big brown truck of happiness, nearly instantaneously. But it's very efficient, but it is not very resilient, right? And that's what the coronavirus is really exposed here. So there are going to be all sorts of primary, secondary, and tertiary order effects, or first, second, third order effects of the changes that the coronavirus is sort of forcing on the system right now. And let's just pick one of them, which is localization, which is sort of what you're saying. Hey, we may have to become less globalized, right? And there will be pros and cons to that, right? So domestic manufacturing. Maybe we're going to have more domestic manufacturing jobs. Some of those jobs will return to American shores. Hey, that's maybe really good news. Probably cost of prices will go up. Maybe that's interpreted as bad news for some folks. Maybe we won't be able to get things quite as fast, but we'll hopefully be able to get them more dependably, right? There are going to be all sorts of trade-offs that are going to need to be made. And Charles, I want to punt to you here because I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about a relocalization of the economy. I also know that you are a student of geopolitics, and I've got to assume that there's going to be all sorts of reshuffling of the geopolitical fault lines as a result of a reduction in globalization, right? Where we're going to become less partners going forward as we have been with certain countries, and maybe begin to become more competitors than we've been in the past. Thinking about China specifically, but probably many other different players as well. What do you see coming forward as the world is maybe somewhat pushed to relocalize? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether you think that's a good or bad thing.
Right. Okay. Well, a part of the fragility that John mentioned in terms of everything is priced to perfection, and the supply chain is organized, optimized for perfection, there's obviously an understanding now that becoming entirely dependent on other nations who may or may not become rivals or even enemies is probably not a very good idea. And it was never a good idea, but it was like, again, when greed is the only incentive and the only judge of whether to proceed or not, if it's just maximizing profit, which is where we've been for the past number of decades, then it makes perfect sense to offshore everything and have these fragile supply chains, because we're going to make another dime on the product, right? And so now there's a question of, well, what other values are important here? And so obviously being able to have food security and security over essentials such as energy, medical supplies, medications, so on and so forth. So that nationalization, if you will, is a very powerful force. And if we look back at history, we can see how it ebbs and flows over the centuries, right? That people form alliances and trading groups and empires and so on, and then they break up and start relocalizing depending on conditions. And so we're in that point now where we're going to transition to valuing stuff that may not have may not be maximizing profit. It may be serving some other purpose, such as securing the essentials for a country, right? And so, and within a country, then you're going to start seeing the relocalization. Like, once it no longer makes financial sense to fly grapes 3,000 miles, then what can we do to foster our local production of essentials, food being one, energy another, and so on. So, and this, of course, fits in with what I see as a more resilient economy, which is relocalized in terms of capital and governance, not just supplies. In other words, if you're going to bring capital back home, then you can invest that locally. And if you bring governance back down to the local level, then you can actually have a political system that's responsive to local needs.
Great. Chris, picking up on Charles's point there about the importance of resilience going forward as sort of the focus of a better economic model, whether it's something we choose or is forced on us, I know is right in your strike zone. Hopefully you have a more resilient broadband connection now, which we'll find out in just a second. I also want to do a little shameless plug. So do me a favor, pull your button-down shirt apart there and show folks what you're wearing.
Well, let's see. You could say it's something about the lies that we tell each other. Silence. Oh, look at that. Resilience. Yeah.
Nice. And I'm going to do a little burlesque striptease here, because underneath mine, I am wearing my resilience shirt too. Shameless plug for Peak Prosperity. We have a lot of resilience merchandise, which we have had for the past couple of years, but right now we're getting a ton of demand for these shirts and the resilience gear, because it really does seem to be the theme of making it through trying times like we're going through right now. So anyways, if you're interested in getting your own version of this shirt, go to peakprosperity.com/gear. Okay, shameless plug over. Chris, back to you. All right, so resilience, definitely the target of your bullseye. To Charles's point, I don't know how much of it you caught, but he basically said, look, we're going to have to go back to more resilient forms of building and running an economy. Before you got cut off, you were basically mentioning that the coronavirus really does seem to be the mortal gut shot that the old system has taken, and this really may be what causes its demise and forces a new era to step up in place. So building on top of that, as you sort of think about greater economic resilience, what are the components of a more resilient economy in your mind?
Well, I actually think there's a lot of good that's going to come out of all of this, resilience being one. And so I highlighted something in a video yesterday, which was that a couple of scrappy people who have a very small cottage industry sewing shop had managed to best the entire structure of the United States government in terms of testing mask materials, figuring them out. I mean, just the best of that scrappy can-do attitude. I think a lot of that got put by the wayside in the last few decades with this whole idea of big institutions, big government, bigger finance, big, and big is failing us enormously. And the virus just exposed how much that was already true. So that's something that I think is this resilience really begins with. It's a fractal thing. You can't have a resilient nation if you don't have resilient states, and you can't have resilient states if you don't have resilient communities. You can't have resilient communities if you have resilient households. So this is what's been exposed. A lot of people have figured out, oh, I need to be a little more resilient. Maybe I should have a little garden going. Maybe I should be a little bit self-reliant around food, energy, the basics, bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And that's all for the better. Businesses have discovered that just in time is cost efficient, but it's terribly unresilient. And we're finding that with supply chain breakdowns right now. So I think everything is up for grabs. I think nothing's going to be the same after this. And I'm a big fan of resilience because I think it has a more meaningful life associated with it. I think it comports better with the reality of the world that we live in. And so I'm really hopeful that there are a lot of positives that are going to come out of this. Most notably, the direction we were going in was unsustainable anyway. So I'm kind of glad, if I can be glad about this, that it stopped before it ran headlong into, say, a ruined ecosystem. Like the ocean just suddenly, decided to give it up and not support life as we know it on the planet or something like that. Because that's honestly where we were going. We were going to use up the last few inches of topsoil so that there were no macro, micronutrients. There was no soil left, just dirt that needed constant fossil fuel inputs. We were just steaming towards all of that. This is a wake-up call, just like 2008 was. And again, in the balance, are we going to be smart? Or are we going to try and be stupid about it? Right now, the Fed saying, hey, let's be stupid. Let's just throw money at the markets until they behave like we want them to. I think that's wrong. I think it's broken. I think a lot of people are starting to get that at this point in time. And many people are waking up and saying, hey, I was never really a fan of the system as it was configured anyway, young people in particular. So I honestly think this is Humpty Dumpty, right? Moment. There's all the king's horses and all the king's men cannot put that old economy back together again. And for many parts of it, I say good riddance. But there are the other parts we'd like to keep. And this is where my concern comes, is that we're not being very proactive, thoughtful, or resilient about how we're approaching this as a nation, possibly as a globe. And we're making a lot of the same stupid choices we made before. And my critique of that, Adam, is just that we don't have leaders right now. We have a lot of managers, and they're not really good managers. A leader is somebody who's willing to boldly make a decision on incomplete information and try new things. Right now, just by way of example, this $1,200 stimulus check that may or may not have arrived at people's houses by the time they watch this. But as it stands right now, nobody's received one, right? How long has it been since they talked about that? Nobody's got one, right? And then they have this rollout where the last people are slated to receive their checks on September 2nd. And I need to note that we're recording this here in April. $1,200, how's that? And they made it all complicated. It's very unresilient. Resilient is the opposite of this fragile thing they created. So the law is about this thick. It's got exclusions all over it. It phases out if you're earning more than $98,000 as an individual. Well, how did they pick that number? Nobody knows. It's based on last year's tax return. So if you lost all your money right now, sorry. Hey, but the checks go first to people who have an EFT relationship with the IRS. But how many poor people have those? Not many. I mean, it's just ridiculous how complicated this all is. So part of being resilient to me is decomplexifying this, and for people to wake up and go, our own complexity is our own enemy. Which, by the way, if you want to read a great book on that, Joseph Tainter's Collapse talks all about that. It's just that there's a level of complexity you grow beyond where it harms you. It doesn't help you anymore. And I believe that the stimulus checks are a snapshot, picture-perfect textbook case of complexity that our managers don't know how to leave behind because they're just managers, and weak ones at that, bad ones. They're not leaders. Everybody in DC who signed off on that, to me, is a foul. Got a big foul, big F.
Well, one thing I'd add to that complexity too is also inequity, right? Where you and I were talking earlier this morning, right? I mean, the big institutions that were holding a lot of that crap debt that was in danger of really going bad fast, they got their checks, making them whole, 100 cents on the dollar within the first couple of days of the announcement, right?
Yep. Yeah, they did. And sometimes 104 cents on the dollar. They were holding losing paper. So here's an example. Mortgage-backed securities, the mortgages that are securing these things, obviously it's something that's just going absolutely tits up right now, right? And this is just dying. And so these mortgage bonds were selling off in price as they should. And then the Fed stepped in and said, oh, we'll buy those. And then they went right back up, not just to par, but better than par. This is as if your personal 401k, you get to reach in and say, this was the worst investment decision I've ever made. Here, Fed, would you like to buy it off my hands? They say, not only will we not buy it for its current market value, not only will we not buy it for what you paid for it, we're going to give you extra money for that. How's that feel? And you'd be like, that's pretty sweet. But they don't give that deal to you. They only give it to the people that the Fed is in a revolving door operation with, where they work at the Fed, leave, and go work there. You want to know the biggest firm that got bailed out in this whole giant mess?
I mean, it gets at Citadel.
It's Citadel. And who works at Citadel? Ben Bernanke. Who's Ben Bernanke? Former Fed chair. That's the revolving door. It's disgusting. It's absolutely horrifying that happens, but it happens right in broad daylight. And people are still kind of like, oh, you know, that's kind of how it is. But it's literally that unseemly. In the last $1,200 measly dollar stimulus check from the taxpayer to the taxpayer, which will probably get billed for it later, is coming out in September.
All right. Well, look, just to build on one other thing you said, what's been really heartening about this, coronavirus catastrophe for us, if we can find a silver lining in it, has been the huge number of Peak Prosperity followers that have emailed you and I and said, hey, because I've been following your advice on living more resiliently, they'd read Prosper, they put the tenets of the book into practice in their lives. They said, I was much more prepared for this than I otherwise would have been, and that, my neighbors were and whatnot. So I was able to protect my family and be in a position to help others versus being caught completely off guard by this, which I think is great for you and I, Chris, because that's exactly why we wrote the book. And to your point about, a resilient economy starts with the resilient individuals and households and communities and et cetera. Really what we've been trying to do personally and with our tribe is to get people to serve as models for that, the benefits of living with resilience. And a lot of times those benefits may not be immediately visible until there's some sort of exogenous shock or period of adversity. And then people can really see the outsized gains that you get by having made those investments beforehand. So, as I look at what's going on, I think one of the few good things that's going on right now with all the chaos and fear and breakages that are happening right now is I think it really is beginning to build an awareness that, hey, resilience actually isn't just a buzzword. It actually is, an extremely valuable lifestyle or way to construct a system. So, all right, with that said, guys, we're a little more past halftime here. I want to try to get from the very macro down to a little bit more individual level in terms of impact of where things are going. But on the way there, I got to quickly zip through currency because it's come up a couple of times, both on the previous conversation we had and today's, and we've got some of our top currency experts here on this call. So, John, you mentioned this earlier, you give central planners and politicians an unlimited printing press, and what are they going to do? They're going to use it, right? they're going to max out that no limit credit card. And that's pretty much what's been happening since the early 70s when we broke all ties to the gold standard, at least here in the US. They printed, like crazy, and they are printing even more crazily right now, right? The Fed has basically just given its own sort of Mario Draghi speech of, we'll do whatever it takes, right? We'll print in the amounts needed, I think was their exact language, but it was basically their way of telling the markets, whatever's needed, we'll write the check for it. So, obviously the system, as you guys have just mentioned several times, is coming to an end. What's going to come next? And I asked that sort of as a dual question of what do you think will come next? And then, separately, because it might not be the same answer, what do you think should come next? So is it going to be a return to sound money? Are we going to move to a national set of cryptocurrencies, like a digital dollar, in the US? Are there other models we should be looking at? John, I know you've been thinking about this forever. You're author of The Money Bubble. You run a site called dollarcollapse.com. What are you thinking?
Well, the reason we can't expect the guys in charge to actually fix the system in a sustainable way is because they learned the wrong lessons from running that system and designing it for the past 4 decades. And the lesson they learned was that whenever anybody major in the financial system gets into trouble, you bail them out. You throw newly created currency at them. And that actually works really well as long as the currency maintains its value. In other words, no matter what the supply of the currency out there is, people still consider it a valuable thing and they'll take it. And therefore, the government is able to manipulate markets by giving money to people. So this ends when people figure out that it's the explicit policy of the government to make the currency worth less and less year after year, and to bail everybody in sight out with newly created currency whenever there's trouble. And then when people lose faith in the currency, which is to say when they get paid or when they get money for whatever other reason, they convert it into real stuff by buying things they can use as quickly as possible. Then the price of real stuff tends to start going up dramatically, and that convinces everybody that the currency is not going to be valuable going forward, and they bail on it. And luckily, we got a lot of historical examples for this. Countries have screwed up their currencies dozens, if not hundreds of times in past financial history, since at least the Roman Empire going forward. And every single time, it plays out the same way. People just lose faith in the currency, it plunges in value. There's a huge financial crisis in which there might be a war, but there might be civil unrest. But it's huge turmoil, however it plays out. And then the currency is replaced with something sustainable, and it's almost always gold and silver. So applying that historical template to the world going forward, we will see some kind of a currency reset, a monetary reset at some point, but not until the dollar and the euro and the yen start to fall in value demonstrably in ways that people can figure out rather than ways that the government can hide. So at that point, the monetary reset will be one of a few different things. We have some new technologies that that make history an imperfect example or a template, but we could go back to the gold standard, for instance, where we just announced that the dollar is now a name for 1/10,000th of an ounce of gold, and go from there. And that would be sustainable, and it would have winners and losers, but if you could control the anger of the losers, you could go forward with that. Or you can have some hybrid gold cryptocurrency, where gold is the bedrock financial asset, and then we do our transacting with Bitcoin or something like Bitcoin. And that would be frictionless and really efficient, and that might work too. Or maybe there's some other crypto related thing that comes along later, or some other precious metals thing that works at the time. But it'll be something like that. And the common theme of all the new monetary systems will be that they take the power away from governments to create unlimited amounts of new money. See, that was our major central flaw. The mistake that we made in 1971 that has caused virtually all the trouble that's come since is we handed that kind of power to human beings. And you can't do that. Human nature being what it is, you inevitably end up perverting the system that you were trying to manage, and you end up with some gigantic crisis like what's coming. So we have to take that power away from people, from governments. Whatever comes next will, if it's done right, we'll do that. And the way you and I as individuals play this transition is we need to move our finances away from fiat currencies. In other words, bank accounts with dollars and government bond funds and things that pay you dollars, and into real assets, gold and silver and well-chosen real estate. The homestead is the perfect real estate example of that, something that actually produces rather than consumes value. And in that way, we're mostly insulated from the transition when it happens, because the people who are stuck with big dollar bank accounts and government bond funds, they see the value of their nest eggs decline dramatically. And the people who have real assets see their capital go up in value, at least in local currency terms. So knowing that that's coming, it gives us kind of a roadmap for how to structure our own finances. And gold and silver are of course at the center of that process, because they're the things that have been the best place to hide out for literally, dozens, if not hundreds of times in history, every single time. There's never been a time when gold and silver became less valuable during a currency crisis. And there's no way to think, or no reason to think that that'll be the case this time around.
All right, so really useful and, sound money systems, what's needed, lots of potentials there, either going back to the future with precious metals or going forward into the future with some sort of hard asset-backed crypto type currency. And the individual level, moving from the paper or the fiat into hard assets, ideally productive hard assets, great way to protect the purchasing power of your wealth. Shifting to you, Charles, real quick, because I know you've written about alternative currency models as well. I think what John said is in alignment with how you look at the world, but there are other potential models out there as well. Could you talk just really quickly about which ones, or at least elements of ones, catch your attention? And I know you've got your own model, the Klein model that you proposed, but perhaps just talk about the fact that there is a moment in time here where we could let 1,000 different options bloom and kind of let them compete for themselves. How do you look at this?
Right, Adam, I think you just touched on what I see as the basic solution, which is an open, transparent market for currencies, both as serving all the purposes of currencies. As John intimated, you could have a currency that serves mostly as a store of value that you keep your savings in, and then you could have a transaction-based currency, which is not trying to be a store of value. And so I think that allowing people to own and transact with a great variety of currencies is probably the way that I would see the way forward. Now, of course, as John intimated, governments hold the power to print money in endless amounts very jealously, right? They're not going to let go of that. They're going to outlaw or ban any private currencies or other alternatives until their own currency is completely gone. And then the people will, the citizens will have to use alternative currencies, which we can see like happening in Venezuela, right? So there will be a thing where you'll be using currency and you'll be breaking the law, because but it'll be an impossible double bind because the government issued currency will be worthless. So. My little proposal was, why not we base issuing currency on the performance of work in a community where that work has value? And that's just one example of a potential for a currency that could be a transactional currency. And but it would be limited because it would only be issued for when work was completed that had value to the community that's issuing it. So I mention this as a potential to suggest that the whole idea that currencies can only be one thing issued by a government somewhere is just, I think that's false. And I think the government issued currencies are a form of fictitious capital. And a lot of people, it seems real, but it's only real if you sell at the top and then transfer that wealth into something real. Well, if you wait till the end game, then you'll realize it was fictitious. And I want to make a quick point about currencies here. A lot of what we think of as profitable or valuable is actually just currency arbitrage. It's like the dollar has a lot of value, and then the Chinese yuan is pegged to the dollar. So a lot of what seems to be profitable and valuable is simply arbitrage in like these fictitious capital currencies. And so when that dissolves, then it's going to be a different, we're going to have to assume a different set of values about what's valuable. And I'll end with a simple example. Let's say we have a new currency called the Quatlu, which for Star Trek fans, about. And your property was worth $1 million, right? And then as the currency gets devalued, it's going to be worth $1 billion, right? Now, then that currency dissolves into nothing, and then we value your house at 1,000 Quatlus. Well, what difference does it make? And to John's point, if your property is producing value, it's shelter and maybe some food and maybe a home business, it doesn't really matter what we value it in. It's the productive value that counts. And any currency is only a reflection of that. And when it doesn't reflect that, then it's fictitious capital.
Okay, great answer. So I want to pull the thread that you mentioned about your particular labor-based model, because I want to switch into now the topic of work. So as I'm talking here, I'm going to put up an animation on the screen showing what's happened with the folks filing for unemployment in the country. Because if you look at a historical time frame, what's gone on in the past 2 weeks is just so historically aberrant. It hurts the mind. We've had 10 million people over the past 2 weeks file for unemployment, and that just dwarfs the volume that's happened ever in American society. So we've got a ton of people who are already impacted by the economic disruption that the coronavirus is wreaking across the world right now. I think I just saw a survey this morning that said 75% of US households have already reported some sort of impairment to their income. 25% of those households are saying that it's a severe impingement. So and I've also seen that half of all small to medium sized businesses are not expected to make it through the next couple of months. They just didn't have the reserves to withstand basically being shut down for several months. So my big question here is, how bad is it going to be by the time the dust settles here? Let's hope that we come down the coronavirus incident rate curve, starting this spring, and hopefully things get under control in the summer. When we all come out of lockdown and we try to kind of get back to business, what's the level of destruction going to be like then? A couple things to add into that question. We've got a bunch of the bullshit jobs that are gone now, and they're going to be gone for a long time, if not forever. I guess my question is are we entering a new normal where the unemployment rate is going to be at a much higher baseline than it used to be? And if so, what would your advice be to people for entering that world, especially folks who are getting laid off during the next couple of months? Is it reskilling? Is it kind of trying to change your perspective on life and really beginning to sort of worry less about getting the top income that you can get, but more about getting real meaning in how you use your labor hours? Chris, I'm going to start with you on this. How bad do you see things being when the dust settles here?
It's pretty bad right now. We've never seen a shock like this before. And if your parachute doesn't open when you're skydiving, it's not the fall that kills you. It's the pace of how fast the ground stops you. So that's what we're seeing right now. It wasn't just that this was sort of a shock. It wasn't just that the world sort of had too much debt. It wasn't just that, we had pensions that were sort of unfunded. These are all true, but it was just a system that was really only could operate if nothing went wrong. I mean, it was priced for perfection. Every single asset class out there was priced as if the future was to infinity and beyond. And COVID comes along and wrecked it like that. And so watching, the COVID moved it at an exponential pace, right? And so what we needed were leaders who could also move at that same pace. And I think there's something they could have done to bust out the magic printing press. Don't do any of this complexity stuff. Just print and throw money as fast as you can into the small and medium-sized enterprises first, households second. These would have been things that could have really made a difference. They didn't do that, right? They're going to throw billions and tens of billions at companies like Delta, and Jeff Bezos wanted $5 billion to be able to pay the people working on his pet rocket project company. And so we have a system where the top down, they get, again, we mentioned the inequity before, it's all flowing there. And what we need it flowing instantly to the bottom. So right now, there are, of those millions and millions of people out of work, those people aren't paying rent or mortgages right now. We're seeing even large companies just stop on the mortgage payments. So when a major retailer says we can't pay mortgages anymore or rent on our facilities, the landlord eats that. And then the landlord eats that to some extent, but then the mortgage company has to eat that. So let's imagine magically this virus went away right now. It's gone. the damage is so intense right now, and the complexity of trying to unravel it is going to be so impossible. The only people I see really making out in this whole thing are bankruptcy lawyers and contract lawyers. They're going to do fine. But otherwise, it's just a million wreck stories out there, and nobody has a plan for how to undo that at this point in time. And even if it did get undone, the thing that I think isn't appreciated yet is the degree to which this is the defining moment of this period of time. I can't even say this generation. So for every generation alive today, this is the defining moment, and behaviors are permanently changed. I was just talking with my 81-year-old neighbor, really great guy, and we were having this conversation, and he opened it up by saying, you know, I don't think I'm going to go to any more things ever in my life where there's a lot of people around. You know, it's just like permanent change that he doesn't want to be around large groups of people. And I agree. I think it's going to take forever for airlines. Forget the cruise industry. You know, those floating death ships that they did some bad stuff to themselves sailing in March, right? That was awful. And concerts, all kind. I mean, just like so many things are going to be changed. But it's not even that people are going to, you know, in a year, forget about this. This is the kind of thing that shifts the cultural DNA, and it's going to completely change all sorts of things. Now, to get sort of to the meatier question, that merely says that things we used to do aren't on the table anymore, but it opens up a whole wide variety of new things that come along with that. So the people who are going to win relatively in this game are going to be those who can get through that adjustment process quicker, realize that if they did have one of those bullshit jobs, it's not coming back, and that they need to reorient themselves towards one of these new jobs that are out there. Because there'll be plenty of jobs out there, absolutely. But a lot of the old stuff is going away. And that's, I think, the hard part for people to get their minds and their hearts around, is just, it's not coming back. You know, it's just, that was permanent damage. And it was the shock of it all that I think makes it irreparable at this point in time, in terms of putting it back together the way it used to be. There's a new thing coming. Some of it's predictable and some of it's going to emerge because it's a complex system, not just complicated. So we'll have these new emergent behaviors. But I think some of that's going to be fairly predictable. Guess what? People still want to recreate. They still want to take vacations, but it isn't going to be kind of like they used to do it. So, you know, you can start to put those pieces together into thinking about more isolated, closer to home, I can drive there kinds of experiences that people might want to have, compared to flying to get on a cruise ship and be in a floating petri dish with 3,000 other people.
I'm really glad that you brought it to this, you know, looking through the positive lens about where the opportunity can lie here, because we're not just out to depress people. As John said, the transition is going to be rocky, but there's going to be all sorts of new opportunities that come up in the midst of it, both employment opportunities and I think just a way to sort of live life differently as well. So kind of bringing it down to the end here, folks, because we're almost at the end of our hour here. You know, two things. One, to Chris's point about, you know, those who can go through the adjustment process early and kind of get a sense for where the puck is going to be and begin to reorient their professional lives towards where that puck is going. You know, we are under lockdown right now. You probably will not have as much forced time to stay in your house as you have right now. And those that are wondering about job security or where they're going to be in this new era, you know, easy for me to say this, harder to do, but this is a great opportunity to use the time that you have to do the inner work and the thought processing about how things are shifting, where, given your talents, interests, passions, et cetera, you might be able to play in this sort of new world order and begin to you know, prepare yourself so that when, you know, we all get to go back out again and the dust begins to settle, you've got a game plan, you've got a trajectory, and you're not just standing there bewildered. Again, I know it's easy to say, harder to do, but you really do have the opportunity right now to do a lot of that initial inner work. All right, so I want to try to end on the real individual scale of things. So Chris mentioned that there's going to be all sorts of entrepreneurial and work opportunities for the right type of people looking in the right types of areas. The question I want each of you to end on is if I can kind of tease out a commonality of what you've been saying on the macro level, is we are entering a future of less. And I know that's looking at it a very specific way, but economic growth is probably not going to be what it was, at least on average, over the past, you know, 20th century, you know, the world that we're used to. shortened supply chains. So we didn't really get a chance to talk much about energy, Chris. I think that's probably a topic too hard to address quickly here at the end, but there may be some energetic limitations as well. And we're going to go through this sort of, very tumultuous transition time that John was mentioning. So if we are entering a future of less, is that a bad thing, right? Or does that give us opportunities to kind of, I think it was Chris who might have said it earlier, look at the things that maybe didn't thrill us about the prior structure, and to ask ourselves, are there ways in which we can do things better going forward, either as a society, or if I can't control that myself as an individual, is there a way for me to approach life moving into this future that may actually, it may or may not yield me as much money, but it may yield me a lot more happiness. Is there an opportunity to do this? Chris, I'm going to let you go, and then I'll just hit down the line here.
Yeah, I actually think there's a lot of positive that can and will come out of this. I know that there's a lot of stress in households as people are under more forced, tight living conditions than they're used to. But at the same time, I think we're going to rediscover that, what really makes life worth living at all is our relationships, is our connections, are the things that I think are frenetic, buy everything you possibly can, go into debt, and then work like a slave to pay all that debt off lifestyle. It really wasn't all that fulfilling for a lot of people. And for those who wake up to that reality, they're going to start asking, I think, a really important question, which is the most important question you can ask yourself, which is, who am I going to be in this life, and what am I going to do with it? How do I begin to add meaning and purpose to this? And there's a lot of opportunity for people to add meaning and purpose. So to make it very personal, my eldest daughter is one of many people in this country who's busy sewing masks and figuring out better mask technology and different materials and supplying those to people who need them, whether on the front line healthcare or in the community. So to get that taste of like, oh my gosh, I'm doing something that really matters. It's really important, seeing the degree to which our national managers didn't even ask anybody to even try and participate in something, because we're too stupid, apparently. We won't even know how to take a mask off without harming ourselves. Kind of dumb, right? To see that breach of trust get exposed is an opportunity for us to reignite those trust networks in ways that really work for us. I think there's way more meaningful jobs coming up. I think we're going to reconnect with all sorts of things local, right? Local food, local entertainment, local, right? And it's going to be good. We're going to get a lot more community out of this, and people are going to discover something I think my great-grandfather and grandmother would have known all along, which is, it's the depth and quality of your local relationships that define your actual sense of meaning and purpose in life, because those are things you can control and participate in and feel good about. And I see a lot of people stepping up to that service plate right now, and myself included. I've been more in service to my local community during this period than I have at any other period of my life, because the time's called for it, and it feels good. So I am actually really hopeful about what's going to come out of all of this, and it means letting go of a lot of stuff that wasn't working.
Yeah. Oh, really well said. And just to add further validity to your point, so we reposted a report on Peak Prosperity the other day about relationships, and largely it's a relationship guide to help people deal with the fact that we're living in cramped quarters with our family members for a lot longer than we're usually comfortable with. But the report concluded with an interview of centenarians, people that have lived over 100 years, asking them about their what advice they have to offer about what makes a happy life, and it's all relationships. It's just literally it's nothing but relationships. I think we can all learn something from that. All right, Charles, how about you? A future or less? Is it necessarily a bad thing, or like Chris, is there good that can come out of it?
Yeah, I think so. And whether we can even step back and say whether we want to try to assign it a term of good or bad, it's going to happen anyway. So we might as well call it good. Let me describe the current global system in one way, and then work from there. The global system right now is optimized to maximize profits, serving the wealthiest consumers. That's the system we have now, right? So if that breaks down, and it is breaking down, what else? What other system? What's the foundation of another system? Well, to me, it's pretty obvious that the foundation is everyone should be doing work that's beneficial and useful. And how do we define that? If we're not going to be looking at maximizing profit, well, then it's what serves your community. And so I know this sounds like an abstraction. So I wrote this whole book called Get a Job and Build a Real Career, where I list 8 essential skills. And so to bring it down from the abstract, I would say, start developing skills that you can apply to any number of tasks or jobs that come up. And so what you want to do is you want to seek a maximum range of skills that you can bring to whatever situation arises. And so rather than predict skill A is going to be very valuable, just, assemble all 8 essential skills and then apply them flexibly as situations arise. That's and I think that's the way to go forward. And I think it is a positive way to go forward.
Great. And those 8 essential skills, they're broken down in your book there?
Yeah, and they tend to, they're related to interpersonal skills, building social capital, and real world skills. Anybody can create their own list, but you get the essential skills and they're going to work for you and your community.
Great. All right. And John, we'll end with you on this topic.
Okay. Well, I think we can take some comfort from the fact that the way we've been living for the past 30 or 40 years was unsustainable and had to end anyhow, right? We were never going to be able to continue living like this, borrowing insane amounts of money to finance stuff that we didn't need for much longer anyhow. So this way, it's ending quickly, instead of in a long, drawn-out way that forces us to suffer through the transition for the rest of our lives. So, we can kind of think of the world as like a person with a really unhealthy lifestyle who has a heart attack, almost dies, but survives, and from then on gets religion about living right, and that's what we're going to have to do going forward. We'll have to separate our needs from our wants and focus on the needs, the things that are really important. And, in the end, letting go of a lot of wants is painful, but in the end, it's beneficial. We'll be a lot happier and healthier once we make that psychological transition. So that it's happening all at once means we get to get it over with a lot sooner. And in that sense, it's a good thing.
Well, there's a quote that we end a lot of our live conferences with. It's a quote from Thoreau that says, "I make myself rich by making my wants few." And I think that's what you just said. Yes. There, John. So totally agree on that. And, to your point, I think anybody who really gave a thought to this knew, to your point, that, look, we're going to be able to continue the overspending way that we had been living beforehand, and it was going to catch up with us at some point. And to your point of it ending quickly rather than in a really drawn out fashion, it's, when you're living with a sort of Damocles hanging over your head, there almost is a sense of relief once it actually falls, because yes, it's painful, but it's no longer a looming threat anymore, right? You can kind of get on with life without that existential worry. So, we've had a lot of people over the years who have said, I hate to say this, but I feel like I'm rooting for the crash because I just wanted to get it over with, right? I just want to get it behind us so that we can actually start moving forward and being smarter. Maybe that is the opportunity here. I think your analogy is apt. Not every patient that has the massive coronary does change their behavior, usually to their end demise. Hopefully we're one of the smarter ones as a society this time. I think the jury's a little bit still out, but eventually we will have to change our behavior. And I certainly hope that this is the incident that does convince us to do so. So with that, I want to thank you guys for a wonderful discussion. This was exactly what I was hoping for. Actually, I think it exceeded expectations, and people had really been looking for this level of high thought on, peering into the future through the current shroud of dust and confusion in the air. And I think you guys have done a really great job of that. So thank you for the time. It's always wonderful to have you guys on individually, but together is just a total treat. So John, Charles, Chris, thank you guys.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah.
My pleasure. Thanks for listening, everybody.